Well, good morning, everyone. So, we have today the Asian Development Outlook presentation. Of course, we have Zhang, who joins us from the ADB. He's been to the ADB since 1997 and currently serves as the Deputy Chief Economist and Deputy Director General of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department. He's written extensively on Asian development, and his latest publications include co-editing the books on income inequality in Asia and the Pacific, was published in 2014, and also the Managing Middle Income Trap, The Challenge Facing China, which was published in 2015. We would like to welcome him to the ILO today. We also have Professor DeMello, Professor Emeritus at the University of Geneva, academic advisor for the Geneva Business School, and also at the Center of Economic Policy Research Fellow and non-resident fellow from the Brookings Institute. Welcome to the ILO. Yep. And of course we have Damien Grimshaw, who's our new research department director, which I believe many of you know. I don't think I need to give a detailed introduction for Damien at this point.
I don't mind.
Oh, wow, way to put some pressure on me, okay? Of course, Damien is the director of the research department. He previously was a professor of employment studies at the Alliance Manchester Business School, University of Manchester, and the director of European Work and Employment Research Center. His research interests include the dynamics of low pay, women positions in labor markets, pay equality, the relationship between institutes and inequality, international comparisons, comparative analysis. His research has been funded by several international organizations, including the ILO, OECD, European Commission, and others. So, Damien, welcome to your departmental meeting. On that note, the structure today, we'll ask Professor Zhang to give about a 25 or 30-minute presentation, and then we'll ask each Professor DeMello and Damien to give about a 10-minute intervention. At that point, then, we will open up to the floor for discussion, if that's agreeable with everyone. Doctor, all yours.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank the ILO colleagues for hosting this event. This is Asian Development Outlook. This is ADB's annual publication. We came out twice a year. Normally, we have two parts. One is macroeconomic outlook of the region of developing Asia, and then another part is a special topic. This year, we are looking at how technology affects jobs. So now, because of time constraint, I will just focus on this part. Let me. Okay. So basically, I want to highlight, talk about the four issues. The first is talk about the rising concern over technology displacing jobs. And then we basically present a cautiously optimistic view on job prospects in Asia. There are a number of reasons I will explain. Then, of course, there are downsides of technology. So I will talk about negative consequences for some workers. And then finally, what this means for policy, how the government should do to harness technology for inclusive growth. So now, I'm sorry. So, okay. So the first is that technology. Of course, we know that technology advances are critical for this productivity growth, for economic growth, and for increasing living standards. But also, technologies displaces jobs. So we know that often there are growing concerns that new technologies will lead to widespread job losses. Some studies, like the World Bank and McKinsey studies, put this proportion of jobs at the risk of being automated at more than 50%. So, and then, of course, recently, there's the OECD study just released several weeks ago. The numbers are slow. So basically, there is a growing concern. But of course, if we look at history, whether it's the first industrial revolution or second industrial revolution, third, there's always anxieties about automation lead to job losses, the widespread job losses. But each time we found that such anxiety is overstated. The question is that whether this time will be different. So in this report, we present a cautiously optimistic view in the context of developing Asia. So I will explain the reasons why we think that our view, basically why our views, we think we have to remain cautiously optimistic about job prospect in the context of developing Asia. But before that, let me just briefly discuss how technologies affect employment outcomes. And first, of course, new technologies, you have a displacement effect. So reduce the job, a little bit high productivity, right? So you displace jobs. So this will reduce the employment. But on the other hand, there are many other channels which can lead to create jobs and lead to increase in employment. The first is so-called the reinstatement effect. So basically, new technologies you need people to handle, to manage, right? So for instance, ICT development, you created numerous jobs, thousands and millions of jobs of software engineers and ICT support specialists in the context of Asia, for instance, and around the world. The second is that the productivity effect. So the higher productivity, that means reduce the prices of the goods or services, and that will increase demand, and then create new employment. But not just increase demand for that particular industry or the same industry or the firms, but there's cross-industry spill over effect. Basically, income effect increase the demand for goods and services of other industries. And then you have lower the prices and the high productivity of that industry or particular firm of industry have affect upstream industry and the downstream industries. So that will also lead to higher demand and then higher employment. But the overall, of course, for each individual technology, we don't know. We cannot say for sure that the job creation always greater than job destruction. But for economy as a whole, history has shown that the job creation has been always greater than job destruction, job displacement because of the new technology. So now let me just explain. This is basically a kind of a framework we used in our report. So there are 4 reasons we present in our report why, the reasons for optimism on developing Asia's job prospect. The first is that new technologies often automate only some tasks of a job, not the entire job, not the job, but some tasks of a job. I will explain later. The second is that technical feasibility of the automation doesn't necessarily guarantee that the jobs will be automated because of the economic feasibility can act as a disincentive. So the issue of economic feasibility versus technical feasibility. The third is rising income and demand. So what we found is rising income and demand in the context of Asia, the data we looked at create more jobs, outweigh the job displacement because of the technology advances. Finally, new technologies often create new occupations and new industries. So let me just explain this each by one by one. So basically here we show that new technologies often involve automating specific tasks associated with the job, not the whole job. So basically any job, we can think consists of a number of tasks, and these tasks can be classified according to whether it's cognitive or manual, and one dimension. The another dimension is whether it's routine or non-routine. So, for instance, on the top right, this corner is a manual and routine. The manual and routine. So these are the kind of predictive physical work. Now, in the micro-level study, the study is based on skill surveys and on expert views on engineering bottlenecks of machine learning, that kind of thing that suggests that this type of job is the highest probability of being automated, 78%. This is estimated from Frey and Osborne paper, is quite well known. But on the other hand, if you look at bottom left side, the tasks are mostly basically non-routine and cognitive. For instance, the managing others, managing people, and applying expertise. So these are jobs associated with researchers and managers, and then they are the risk of being automated is very low. For instance, managing others only 9%, and applying expertise only 18%. So basically, these are the jobs, tasks which are non-routine and cognitive. So the point we try to make is that even though a particular job, for instance, we have a different task, some tasks will be automated, will be done by machine, but the other tasks of the job will still have to be done by human. So what happens is that the repetitive and routine and the manual work will be done by machine, and the people will focus more on non-routine and cognitive. The one example, of course, is a bank teller. So the ATM machine displays that part of the job, but the bank employees, for instance, in the case of developing Asia, number of employees in the banking sector remain, it has been growing, constantly, even though ATM machine has been widespread. So that is one example. So that is the one point, first point. The second point is that economic feasibility, technical feasibility versus economic feasibility. What if we found in the context of Asia is that industrial robots are concentrated in capital-intensive sectors where employment shares are low already. For instance, we found this is data for 2005. For 2015. The largest two sectors, use industrial robots are the electrical and electronic sector, industry and locomotive. Together, they account for more than 80% of the robot sales in 2015. But together, they only employ less than 13% of the manufacturing employment. On the other hand, if you look at the textile sector, food sector, combined, they employ more than 30% of the manufacturing employment in developing Asia, but they use only less than 1% of industrial robots. So basically, because the labor-intensive industry, you have a low wages related to capital-intensive, so the scope of adopting robots still low. So, of course, generally in developing countries, low labor cost still, the fact. So, what we are saying that for the next 20 or 10 years, 20 years, so probably this introduction of robots will be limited, especially for labor-intensive industry. So third, the reason is rising income and demand. So basically, we use multi-regional input-output table we developed in our department, and we look at basically try to decompose change in employment for the period of 2005 and 2015, about 10 years time, into different components, right? Because that exercise covers 11 developing Asian economies. So these developing Asian economies account for 90% of the developing Asia's population. So it's quite representative. Basically, changes in employment for this period of time can be decomposed into the first is the so-called within. This is global value chain because the multi-regional, the input-output table. So we look at the global, I think total is the input-output covered is like 48 countries, whatever have a data. So we can decompose into within GVC effect. So within GVC effect is basically within global value chain, the technology effect, so improvement in productivity because of advanced technologies is associated with 46% reduction in employment. This is equivalent to 71 million jobs a year. Then we have a job, the task relocation because of the global value chain. So basically, tasks move from one country to another. During this period of time, actually we found is increase associated with 2% increase in employment, associated with equivalent to 3 million jobs a year. Then there is a country level efficiency improvement, so the TFP in the country level, that is associated with 20% reduction in employment, is equivalent of 30 million jobs a year. So that is overall is within GVC. And then there is a between GVC, basically change in consumption patterns that, so for instance, increased demand for more, services, or basically change, less demand for food, that kind of consumption change, we call it between GVC change. This is associated with a 13% reduction in employment, the equivalent to 19 million jobs a year. This is, on the other hand, we have an income effect. Basically, because of the higher productivity and then increased income, so we have own country effect. Basically, the high income of particularly its own country is associated with 80% increase in employment. This is equivalent to 122 million a year. And then the rest of the world income, basically falling demand, also associated with 8% increase in employment and then equivalent to 12 million a year. So overall, basically, the change in employment during this period of time is we see the 11% increase in employment. So for this 11, I'm talking about 11 economies in developing Asia, this is equivalent to 17 million jobs a year. So yearly increase in employment is 17 million. So this is basically what we're saying is the job creation from rising income outweighs job displacement by technology. That is the point we try to make. So let me just skip this slide. Now, this rising income, the job creation because of rising income outweigh job displacement because of high technology applies. If you look at this cross-country data, this apply actually across all the countries. You can see the technology, we combine the country level, the efficiency improvement, and the GVC specific technology together. So you can see that technology advances lead to reduction in jobs, of course, right? So, but on the other hand, the income effect, including both own income and own country income and foreign income, significantly increase job creation. That's outweigh the job displacement because of the technology. We also look at the offshoring, the issue of offshoring. Basically, this global value chain, the Asia very much benefited from this global value chain, and then for FDIs, go to Asian countries and assembly companies, and assemble parts, put into final goods, and then ship it back to developed countries. So the issue of often asked is whether this reshoring, because of the technology advances or the adoption of robots in advanced countries, will affect developing countries, especially Asian countries. They very much depend on the global value chain. What we found is that for developing Asia as a whole, the share of the job dependent on falling demand is not that big, only 10% overall. But of course, we can say 10% is big or small. So, but overall, we feel that is manageable. Certainly, is a risk. Reshoring is a risk. But for some countries, actually, for instance, for Vietnam, the share is 20%. So very much, labor intensive assembly, that kind of very much involved in global value chain, but they still labor intensive. So 20% depend on falling demand. So that is kind of is a risk. But the TB China share is also high, even higher, 24%. But we think that TB China is already very up on the value chain, so that shouldn't be a big problem. But overall, for developing Asia as a whole, 10% depend on falling demand. So overall, we feel that risk is manageable. Finally, is that I mentioned that technology often leads to new occupations. So in the early 19th century, we know that the car industry created a lot of jobs for auto repairs workers, for car dealers. Now, more recently, of course, ICT development created millions of jobs for ICT, for software engineers and for the IT support specialists. But here we looked at 3 countries, India, Malaysia, and the Philippines. We looked at the national occupation classification and compare, for instance, in the case of India, we compare 2015 with 2004, and Malaysia, 2008, 1998. And so basically, we look at what changed, what are the new titles appear in this national classification of occupations. So we found that in the case of India, for instance, from 2004 to 2015, there are total 120 new titles come up. Right, this accounted for more than 3% of total titles in 2015. So basically, in the case of Malaysia and the Philippines, basically we see new job titles come out. Now, interestingly, these new titles are mostly in the category of non-routine and cognitive, is on the left bottom side. So overall, 60% or 70% or 80% of these new titles in non-routine and cognitive. That means, yes, jobs will be created, occupation will be, new occupation will come up, but they mostly will be in non-routine and cognitive rather than manual and routine. So that, of course, have implications for the policy, right? So basically, now this is just show type of occupations where the jobs, new job titles come out. So now let me talk about the downside of the technology. Basically, as I said, jobs will create, but they mostly will be non-routine and cognitive. Here, what we found is that the use of robots is associated with a reduction in routine employment share, but increase in non-routine employment share. This is a global data set. We have whatever data available for, on data, especially on the use of robots. We share the intensity, change in intensity, robots intensity on the vertical and on the horizontal. The vertical is a change in employment share. So on the right-hand side is non-routine employment share. This we see the positive correlation, and left-hand side is routine employment share is negatively correlated. So that means in the future, demand for non-routine jobs will increase, but for routine job relatively will decline as more robots are used. And then this is just some the regression analysis. We try to control for other factors. So what I said, the pattern remains true. Especially if you look at on the right-hand side at the bottom, we look at difference between developed countries and developing countries. The impact on routine jobs even more significant in developed countries, but less on developing countries, because I think that because of developing countries, the labor cost is still low as opposed to the investing in robots. So you can see that dummy variable, the developing country with robots adoption, the coefficient is positive. So now this is basically the same story. Increase in non-routine cognitive jobs is evident across Asia. We look at annual growth in employment of wage workers by job title, job type. So the red is manual, declining, and this annual growth, different period of time as shown at the bottom, and blue is up in positive growth. Non-routine cognitive jobs growing, but manual jobs, declining. And then this chart is basically wage. The wage have grown more for non-routine cognitive jobs, so that means that will leave low-skill workers behind. So that, of course, have a significant implication for income inequality, as we've shown that in many Asian countries, like OECD countries, like advanced countries, income inequality has been rising in many countries, in China, India, Indonesia. So we have done study in the past. Now this is just an example of the BPO sector in the Philippines. This is the results from a survey, Business Association survey, and the BPO Business Association survey. What they found is that over time, for instance, from 2016 to 2022, the share of low-skilled the BPO workers would decline from 47% to 22%. On the other hand, basically the low skill, basically, the call center, you take up the phone call, it's very simple. You don't need abstract thinking, it's a routine and manual, not manual, but some cognitive even, but it's a low skill. But on the other hand, the medium skill and high skill jobs demand will increase the share in terms of share. So that is an example that in the Philippines, for instance, that there will be a shift towards medium and high skill jobs. So that brings to this what does it mean for policy. So basically in the report, we had three broader categories of the policies. The first is the government should take actions to respond to the downside of the technology. So in this area, basically, we highlighted four important areas. The first is education reform, and to promote lifelong learning, and then skill training, especially improve the quality of education. We have done early studies in the case of Asia. Many countries, the quality of education is low. For instance, if you look at the PISA test, the results is very low. But of course, there are countries, like Korea and Singapore, very high, even better than OECD countries. But by and large, is this issue. The second is we should keep the labor market flexible, but at the same time, we need proactive labor market programs to support unemployment. For instance, job centers or employment placement services in many Asian countries, these are not still common. And then we need to strengthen social protection, including unemployment benefits and expanded health insurance, public work programs and targeted income transfers, and minimum wages. Minimum wages should keep up with improvement in productivity. And then a tax policy. So all this needs to public finances. So we need more tax revenue. Asia, by and large, tax revenue as a percent of GDP compared to the global average is very low, still low. Not very low, but still low. There are large scope to increase tax space, and by improve tax administration and broaden tax base. Another point is to make income tax more progressive by introducing capital gain tax and inheritance tax, property tax. So in Asia, for instance, only 4 countries have inheritance tax. Only 4 countries. So we argue that these are inherent progressive taxes needs to be introduced. So this is how to respond. And then, this is just some slides because of time constraints. This is the public social protection spending as percent of GDP Asia compared to OECD or compared to world average in many countries much lower. And then this is basically to show personal income tax as a percent of GDP. For in the case of China, for instance, less than 1.5%. As opposed to OECD is about close to 9%. So there's a mileage to increase the role of the personal income tax to reduce income inequality. And then the full agenda is broader, so we think the government should make use of new technologies to improve the delivery of public services. So which, for instance, social protection, right? So improve the implementation and the efficiency of social protection system. And the government should also put the right infrastructure in place to support R&D and innovation, especially ICT infrastructure in Asia. Many people, the access to broadband, the internet is still very low. So there's a large mileage to improve, and also internet is very slow. So the more investment in ICT infrastructure, and then finally, of course, to ensure that the typo there, they must ensure the technology developed in ways that benefit people and protect their rights. For instance, data privacy and antitrust, the fair competition. So I think let me just stop. That's it. Last slide. Yeah. Thank you very much. I hope I will not. I will not stay too long.
I'm very proud that you stayed within time and then allowed us to catch up. So thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you.
If I could turn to Professor.
Thank you. Let's try to. Thank you.
The escape key to get to your slide. I'd like to now turn to Professor DeMello to give his reactions.
Okay.
So-
How do I escape? All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. But to put this on too, okay? Are you with me? Yeah. Thank you very much for this invitation, and I would say also for an enlightening presentation. I like this. This is one of. I worked at the World Bank for 15 years, and we always used to say before the World Development Report would come out at the fourth iteration, is this content free? So people would say no. Oh, do another round. Is it content free? Fifth, yes. Okay, ready to go. So anyway, this is not one of those reports. I think there's a lot of content. It's fact-based. I think it's very good. I found it very enjoyable to read, and I hope I can get a hard copy for as a reward. I enjoyed it very much.
Okay.
And it's a pleasure to be here. I just want to make a couple of comments. First, for my background, I'm a trade economist, but now doing development economics. And these days I'm working a little bit on Africa, and I'm just thinking about Africa all the time. As you know, one of the problems in Africa is McKinsey and other reports in 2012, 2013, we have to create 120 million jobs before 2020. So, employment is a big problem over there. So I'll have a few remarks on that. But before, just while listening to your presentation, I thought it's a good point when you said, well, that this is slightly, I would say, we've been overly pessimistic in the past, and therefore I think fact-based analysis shows that we should be moderately optimistic. And I think that you've done a very good job at doing the best you can. And the best you can is to predict the future from the past, because we don't know the future. So, okay, there's, I just want to make one set of comments as a trade economist. As we know in the past, we were overly pessimistic on several occasions. On one of them, when NAFTA came, that was more than 20 years ago, you had Ross Perot, and people said, oh, all the jobs will disappear to Mexico, and the growth rate of Mexico will go up by a lot. Now, 20 years later, the effects have been much less than what was predicted in those elections. So when you look at it as a trade economist, we tend to always think that prices are determined in the world market. Prices are determined in the world market. Okay, now, if you have transport and communication costs, prices fall. Therefore, your wages should be set in Beijing, was the title of one of these provocative papers, saying, are your wages set in Beijing? And the answer, the trade economists would tend to say, well, maybe more, not more or less, but in that direction, while labor market economists tend to see the wages are not determined by prices internationally, but in the local labor market. So in this view, I think there's something to be said. I wouldn't say this report falls exactly in that category, but it is in there. So I think there's a lot of evidence in the past that there's been a lot of complementarities, and the complementarities, let's say, between robots and workers, skilled and unskilled workers in the past, are likely to continue, and that is maybe part of the foundation that will support what you're saying. Now, nonetheless, just one question that's so obvious from what's going on these days is, is what my colleague Richard Baldwin calls the fourth, the great unbundling. Are we going to have a situation in which you have intellectual property that stays in the north, and then you have this great new alliance? In the old days, you had alliance eventually between workers and owners of intellectual property in the north, but nowadays, with the cost of communication having dropped to zero, maybe it'll be between the north and the south. We don't know that, okay? But if that were the case, then maybe, the history will not necessarily repeat itself, and the approach of geography to international trade is one, to development in general, is one in which, if you have great markets, large markets, which you certainly do now in Asia, then everything will go over there. And if you think about politically what's happening, just steel tariffs on China, this is about intellectual property. It's not Trump and everyone knows that putting steel on tariffs is going to hurt the U.S. in the short run, and the retaliation and so on. So, but the intellectual property issue is an important one, and we don't know how that's going on. You don't, we don't, and that's something that we can, we can think about. Maybe reshoring will take place, which is part of what you're arguing, but maybe not. So these are just the general remarks. So what I want to do is just try to, where's it? Can I go there? Yeah. Okay, so I want now to go and say, look, I think that was very good, and I was also I didn't comment, but I was in the room when Mary Howard Dreimer presented the report on manufacturing-led development at risk, which was quite interesting too. And in that report, what I liked a lot, which you haven't done as much as maybe you could do in the future, is about making comparisons across industries. Okay, so the industry all industries are not the same. Of course, you're kind of handling it in some way, but you haven't focused it as much as the other report, and I think that would be nice. And also a little bit more, maybe a comparison. The World Bank does a lot of that, is just looking at reports in which you do comparisons across regions, and there you do a lot within the region, which is great. And in fact, within the region, you have some relatively rich and very poor countries, so that's true. So let me come now to Asia. Can it replicate? So let me just first look at the employment, which what I said earlier. If you look here, you can see that this is from the Trouble in the Making report. When you see the share of manufacturing value added, what took 200 years, the Great Divide, to build up. In the last 20 years, you see what happened in the high-income countries. It fell. And look at sub-Saharan Africa. It stays where it is. Population growth is huge. We know there's pressure. I'll come back to that in my last 2 minutes if I have the time. You look also at manufacturing employment. You look at the shares. Well, you see that sub-Saharan Africa, there's not much there. Okay, so how do I go back? Okay. So now, why is it so important in Africa? We always know it's very important, but one of them, there's been this renaissance of growth in Africa. And if you look here, I'm taking the comparison of Africa with South Asia and East Asia. And if you look here, these are the headcount ratios under 125 a day. And you see Africa not doing, sub-Saharan Africa not doing too well, and then now sort of not catching up, but keeping up. So South Asia and East Asia, they've really gone down, the people in poverty now. This is the effects of growth have been very, very positive. We know that growth reduces poverty, it increases inequality. The question how much policy may influence that, but it reduces poverty. Okay, but the question is, when you look a little bit more into some details here, is what is the elasticity of poverty reduction as measured by the change in the fall in absolute percentage points of poverty? How is that related to growth? Now I'm looking at decadal rates. This is 1980 to 1991 and 91 to 2011. What you do see is what you expect, that if you higher growth, look at South Asia, East Asia, then you have larger decline in headcount ratio, very, very large, right? I mean, here you see, 50 percentage points, that's a lot. It's as if you go from 70% to 20, huge, okay? But look at sub-Saharan Africa. You had decent growth, but much less, much less, the elasticity is much lower in both periods. Now, that's where geography and other aspects, institutions and other aspects are important. And for Africa, of course, it's very easy to say institutions may not be as conducive as they should be for global value chains, because the global value chains require some investment by multinationals in Africa. Maybe that'll happen, but so far, they have not participated in them, and the pickup in growth has not been accompanied by as much. So that's one of the problems here that's been noted in the literature. The second one, I think, which is also going to be a problem in Africa, is the early peaking of manufacturing in Africa. And I have a couple of slides here. This one is taken from The Economist. They always have very, very nice presentations here. And here you're looking at the year in which manufacturing employment peaks. And what has been observed is manufacturing employment peaks, and the size of the bubble is what the share is relative to the U.S. So, are you peaking at 80% of what the share of manufacturing was at its peak in the U.S. or not? Well, you see, as you go along in time, then you see that you're peaking much earlier, okay, and at much lower, and you're peaking much lower. That's really a problem. And if you look, there's another one that I will not take. You have to trust me. I'll just give you one very quick one. Okay. Oh, do I have another one? No. Okay, I didn't put it on. Okay. So, what are part of the reasons here? Well, it's not. We don't know too much about it, but we do know, nonetheless, the World Bank Enterprise Services are not that great. But you have maybe up to 50 or 100 manufacturing firms where you have detailed data across a number of countries. So here we're comparing 12 or 13 sub-Saharan African countries with other countries more or less at the same level of income per capita. So, how does Africa compare to Laos, Vietnam, other low income? So let's just look at labor. Now, what is rather striking is when you look at GDP per capita, you see GDP per capita, they're not that different, Bangladesh, India, and these other countries, right? But labor is much more expensive in Africa. Ethiopia is, I didn't put it in there, Ethiopia is the exception. So, there's a puzzle here. Why isn't labor cheaper? So, you can look at it here. The slope of the line is much flatter than in other parts of the world. So, this issue for this is not robotics yet. Will that change? I don't know. But at least on the observed pattern, it's not the case. So then, the other thing, which is, is labor expensive in real terms? Because maybe labor is really expensive in real terms. That's the price level enigma. The price level is relatively high compared to Balassa, Samuelson, PPP. So look at it here. You see here that what you do see is the relationship between price levels and GDP per head. This is one of those strong stylized facts that you teach in international economics, that price levels go up with GDP per capita. But what you do see is that the price levels have been going up faster than predicted for the other parts of the world in Africa. So we try, here, this is a paper in a recent, it's a paper it's in the, I'll give you the slides afterwards, in which you have the references to that. Then you try and then find out how much of this effect, the 30%, higher than would be expected, how much can you chip away and explain through quality of institutions, subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. And you still can chip away maybe half of it. You reduce the gap to 15%, but it still remains an enigma. In general, labor is not cheap. So you can think about other issues. Like labor is not cheap because of geography and so on. But, okay, that is really a big problem. So, and I finished. I think I've been 10 minutes already, no? Okay, so I'll give you my last two, because we always have to, you're looking into the future. So I look even further into the future. We've been working, actually recently we we prepared a report for the COP21 climate change in Paris. We edited a volume where we're looking at what was the future of the planet and climate change. So if you look at it from a geography, or let's say from a regional point, let's just look at some of the preoccupation in the future. This is I've presented this a few times. I kind of like it. What it shows is let's say that the objective is to have to have a stabilized carbon emissions, so that by 2050, you're no longer increasing the CO2 stock. Okay, CO2. It's a little more complicated. It's not just CO2, but what you do see here is population shares, and you see here by region. So here you have sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, it's in French, but you can see what you have is the shares. The bubble is of the total emissions of CO2 related to it. So you see, of course, Asia, in fact, that's the biggest share of all, followed by North America, Europe, and so on. Then, of course, what you have is the per capita. Now, one of the objectives, you could say, it's maybe a very rough one, is we would like the world eventually by 2050, 2060 to get emissions per capita the same across regions. So that means that there's room, there's room in Africa. There's not too much room, as you can see, in Asia and so on, and even less in some of the other parts. So that's where we stand today on the flow. But let's go and look a little bit more, and that's what I wanted just to go here, and this will be my last comment here, is, well, we have projections. They're not good, but we have projections on population, the UN population. So if you take the median scenario, you can say, look at what population shares might be by region. And then you also have very, well, far out in the future, but you have detailed predictions about what in 2050 damages will be. Now, damages here are the predicted increase in temperature, which we know will be higher in Canada and Russia, and they will have productivity go up in agriculture and in other parts, and it will not go up as much in the tropical areas. But so far, the climate science model showed that it's much more. You probably know that the sustained number of days which are above the 90th percentiles are much higher in low latitude. So that means that the damages will be higher. Now, if you look at the same thing, the 45-degree line, so here the 45-degree line says, are your damages greater or not than your population share? You see that sub-Saharan Africa and here now also South Asia, and to some extent Asia, will be getting a larger share. They're predicted to get a larger share of damages, and I think that will be a huge as it now stands, it's a huge challenge for all of us. So I want to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor de Mello. If I could now turn to Damien Grunschall for his comments.
Thanks very much.
Sorry, how to switch it off?
This is, well, thanks very much for the chance to provide another discussion point. It was a pleasure, really, reading this report. It's a very detailed report. This is only one section that was presented here. So I'm sure you're familiar from previous annual reports. There's a very detailed section about economic and employment prospects, which makes for a fascinating read too, as well as lots of detail on the different countries and regions. This sort of 60, 70-page section on the implications of technology is very nicely motivated, and I think in a way that aligns with the ILO's mission statement, which is to ask, how can technology create more and better jobs? And that's the task the report sets itself. And I think it goes some way to answering that question, and I think most of my points will be around the extent to which we can do, perhaps within the House, but also perhaps ADB do more to be sure that we can have technologies that create more and better jobs for the largest segment of the population. So the more we can learn from Asia, the better, because it's the largest regional labor force in the world, nearly 2 billion workers. So I do think we need to look to Asia to understand any future of work, and that goes without saying. So I've got 5 points. I'll try and keep them short, and because I think we need to take questions from everybody else too. So how does technology make better jobs? Now, the answer in the report relies on utilizing this analytical framework taken from the sort of latest economics analyses, Auto, Levy, Murnane, and others, and relies on this sort of 2x2, where you distinguish between routine and non-routine tasks, and you also look at manual versus non-manual, but then they go further and they break down the non-routine tasks into those requiring cognitive skills as well as interactive skills. And that creates a very nice sort of disaggregated framework to look at jobs. I agree with the other point that I was looking for more details on industry, but you can only do so much in a report of this nature, and I think it really does a lot with what it tries to, with the data it's got. There are interesting exceptions to some of the general findings, so every now and again we do get an insight in some of the industries. So there's a lot of mention of the sort of exceptional case, the Philippines call center work, for example, every now and again in reports. Now, if we're going to use this analysis of routine, non-routine, cognitive, or interactive, at some point we need to know whether non-routine jobs are better than routine jobs. Maybe that's a silly thing to say, I don't know. But one, as a researcher, one has to ask this question, right? Why do we assume non-routine jobs are better than routine? And of course, I'm saying jobs, but the report's careful in talking about tasks within jobs. One of the things we know about technology is it's gradually seems to be unbundling tasks from jobs. So we need to keep an eye on that. But it does talk about tasks, although tasks are assigned to occupations, so it's a bit complicated. We know from work on call centers, going back to call centers, the global call center report that was released a few years ago looked at one type of non-manual routine job in call centers and showed very clearly that across different countries in the world, some jobs are better than others, and quite dramatically better than others. So for the same type of routine, non-manual work, we know that there are various other institutions that can shape the quality of that job. So for a given technological change and a given impact on numbers of jobs, we know that whether they're better or worse depends on other factors. I mean, we know that, well, that's our sort of stock and trade within the ILO. What kind of job quality does the report look at? There's a little bit of attention to wages. There are obviously data issues. I think within the ILO, we'd want to look more at working hours, the length, how they're regulated, the extent to which workers have control. We'd want to look at worker voice. We'd want to look at task discretion. So even if these are routine tasks, are you in charge of saying when you're going to do the tasks, even if it's routinized, right? Can you control the pace of those routine tasks? These are still important, and they're the kind of things that make for a better or worse routine job. Of course, the other big thing is employment rights, and one of the big things we know about technology these days is that it's sort of reshaping the boundaries of employment rights. So the case of Uber, is I think an interesting one there, which seems to be redrawing boundaries of employment relationships between what's self-employed and what's a worker, and that has big implications. There's some analysis in the report of this, the new company Gojek in Indonesia, the motorcycle drivers, and points to evidence that shows that there's greater stability of earnings, in fact, to Gojek drivers. I think according to the company itself, but greater continuity of earnings because of the efficiency of matching supply and demand, right, for that service. That might be something we want to look at in more detail. But we know from Uber legal cases that there's a strange relationship between these platforms and the workers. And to a lot of there's a lot of cases where the platform is acting more as an employer rather than a sort of a matching device. Even charging penalties for sickness absence in the case of Uber, or restricting continuity of vacation time. So there are interesting things. So we need to ask who the technology is for and who's controlling the technology, because if we're moving towards monopolization of platforms, that's something which may have severe implications for job quality. That was 2 points, I don't know, bundled into one. The third point I wanted to make, again, the report does a very nice job of saying that technologies should be driving up productivity, and that might happen within sectors or across sectors. And there's a nice decomposition of intra and inter-sectoral growth. And again, that should be better for job quality. But again, we've got to ask, what are the conditions under which that assumption might hold? I think it's quite a number of years now where we've seen a bifurcation between productivity growth, the little that there is, and real earnings growth. Those two things have completely separated out at the aggregate regional levels. And this is a cause of great concern, and it's a puzzle, right? Why has there been this bifurcation between productivity growth and real earnings growth? And I think, together that might be something we can look on. That's a major challenge to realign those two trends. The fourth point, again, I agree with the earlier statement that it would be nice to see disaggregation by broad industry categories, not least because of the size of the sector of agriculture. In many of the countries within the region, of course, there's a great diversity. I mean, some countries in the region, Hong Kong, Singapore, is sort of 0. Other countries, Bhutan, Pakistan, India, is probably around 2 or even more, 2 in 5 workers. So there's a huge spread there, of course. But it'd be nice to hear more about the types of technologies in the rural economy that are anticipated in this report. Because I think we kind of think about sort of manufacturing sector, and I think many of the examples of manufacturing sector, it'd be nice to think about the rural economy. The fifth and final point concerns the final call for government interventions. The first thing to say is that I think we need to think about all social actors, especially business. So there's a very nice innovative analysis in the report on the global value chain. So we need to be thinking about all the stakeholders in that global value chain, and I think that's many of the manufacturing companies in Asia would want the retail companies, for example, to be on board, as well as the creditors. When we think about skill formation, does your organization have an idea of an appropriate level of government expenditures in supporting skill formation? So is there an appropriate level of public expenditures going into the public infrastructure for schooling, as well as subsidies for perhaps for business spending? What's the policy recommendation regarding a skill levy on employers, for example, to support apprenticeships? And how should those costs be divided? There's a very useful set of references on labour regulations, social security protection. In fact, using some of the ILO analysis under Peter Auer, talking about protected mobility. So there the idea is that you protect workers rather than jobs. But of course, this is very challenging. As far as I know, there's only really a couple of countries in the world that have done this successfully, perhaps Denmark, Sweden, where they've got a very well-resourced state and they're able to support welfare income as workers move in and out of jobs. Denmark's got very, very weak hiring and firing, but it provides security through its welfare net. But how realistic is it to expect that kind of flexicurity model, if you like, can be established, and how do we support calls for that? I mean, you call for more progressive taxation policies, which is, again, very welcome. Is that part of that? You call for a universal minimum wage rather than industry minimum wages. Again, I think that's welcome. I think from an ILO perspective, it provides for a simplified rate, and it prevents industry lobby groups who often may cause sort of political difficulties in many of the countries. So many of the countries in Asia will have industry minimum wage rates. You use this sort of IMF rule of thumb to fix minimum wages at 40% the medium wage. Are you also expecting countries to have a regular fixing? In fact, you say that minimum wages could or should go up by the rate of productivity growth. That might be one way, in fact, for productivity growth to move more in line with wages. So I'm not sure that's something the ILO says it in its minimum wage policy guidelines, but that's a very interesting, challenging policy recommendation, I think. It's very interesting. The final thing is, what mechanisms would you like to see for regular adjustment of minimum wages? Is that something where there should be more social dialogue involved? So I had a few points around the technology, the focus of the report, but then your final section on policy recommendations also caught my eye. But overall, very, very fascinating report. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Damien. Would you like to react now or go to the floor for questions?
Let me just quickly.
Sure. There you go.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the comments, both discussions. I think I should say that actually we, over the years, we have benefited a lot from colleagues from ILO. Duncan, for instance, has been helping us a number of studies in the past few years. And this study actually, Duncan is also one of the I think it's the lead consultant for us, right? Especially we benefit a lot from the policy side. So that's why I think a lot of our policy discussions are very close to ILO views. And actually we also have a colleague, he is one of the authors, Sammy, he was ILO staff. Yeah, so he joined us last year. So he so certainly, I think I have to say that this report has benefited a lot from the inputs, and the expertise from ILO. Now, the specific comments, I think the one issue is the by sector or by industry level. Actually, we do have the results, but we have, I think in the report we presented the manufacturing, agriculture, and services. But we don't have results on disaggregated because the input-output table actually, we have 35 industries. 35 industries. So then you basically look at the industry, but the problem is presentation is very difficult, very messy to present in report. So we did not, we just look at, we report the results for manufacturing, agriculture, and services. Of course, agriculture sector is different from manufacturing service. Even high income, the agriculture sector employment will decline because the issue is still dual economy. So there's still an issue of transfer large amount of surplus labor out of agriculture sector into manufacturing service. So even if the high income, the labor actually the agriculture sector employment will decline in any case. So that's why I only showed the chart for manufacturing, and on policy side, you mentioned about like minimum wages. So we of course ADB, these are the things we said, but we don't get into too much detail in terms of how can implement. For instance, you're talking about a mechanism how to enforce minimum wages. I think in the past we're talking about the collective bargaining, for instance. We support that. But I don't know this, in this report, we focus more on the jobs and in terms of implications, and then, so we did not go into too much detail in terms of, and also the spending on education, for instance. So we have been seeing that in Asia, government spending on education share as percent of GDP has been low. So it needs to be increased, but we don't have a target number. Obviously, I think we often we look at it, what is the OECD level. And then we see there's a gap there, but we don't prescribe like a specific target. I think some countries do have targets. For instance, in Indonesia, they have a target. I think it's a 13% of a point, 13% of a budget we have to spend on education. That's the government is a mandate, but not all the countries have that. But we certainly often, we highlight the issue that we need more spending, government spending on education, and then, to narrow the gap with the OECD countries. But we don't have ADB itself. We don't have a particular number. So I think now Professor De Mello mentioned about early peaking of manufacturing jobs. Actually, same issue in Asia. We looked at in the past, and actually, your chart shows the manufacturing employment for China is 40%. It's too high, 20%. That is, I think maybe your number is more industry, yeah. But manufacturing is a lot smaller. And then share has been declining actually. So, but the early peaking of manufacturing employment, not only Africa but many Asian countries we highlighted. Yeah. So let
Not
me.
the Gang of Four, though. Not the Gang of Four. The Gang of Four was the export-led growth in the the second
Yeah.
unbundling. That was the one where everyone's saying, can Africa or other low-income countries replicate that model? And that model, it was the sort of manufacturing-led growth with employment peaking and much higher.
Not because of technology advances, then that the manufacturing employment peak lower now. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the comments. What I'd like to do now is open it up to the floor. So if I could ask you to state your name, and then the question will take one or two rounds. So I'll start with Cher.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Cher Varick. I'm at the ILO's International Training Center in Turin. But most recently I was in India and had many discussions with Dr. Rana Hassan about some of these issues, and it's very interesting to see the report now. I think one of your messages is critical. I mean, that technological feasibility does not mean economic feasibility, because I think, this approach of Frey and Osborne is deeply flawed for that very reason. And that, of course, led to many spin-offs that focused on the threat of automation and the risk to jobs, which was based on technological feasibility, but with no look at any economics. I think that's a very important issue, because I think even in India, you have a very strong focus now on some of these issues about Industry 4.0 robots. But the reality is, a country like India, if you look at the figures, a couple thousand robots are being supplied each year to India, but mostly in the automotive sector. It's not affecting other sectors as you showed. But I think important question is, in that context, are we at an inflection point, which is the assumption, that sort of technological feasibility discussion, but clearly technology and jobs, that interaction has been going on for decades, as you pointed out. And would you agree that there isn't any strong evidence that there is a major change in terms of how technology interacts with jobs yet? I think given where technology is impacting in those small sectors, and which are particularly capital intensive, and I think one aspect that is important to me is to look at what actually drives technology adoption in the light of this economic feasibility. You do not see this happening consistently across countries. So India's had 2,000, purchased 2,000 robots last year compared to 70,000 in China. Indonesia is a similar level to India. What is driving that? I think an analysis of explaining the technology adoption, which anyway varies across countries and also within countries and within sectors, is critical. Of course, there's a lot of discussion about technology lags in technology adoption. The work of Hoban and Common, etc., looking at the speeding up of adoption across countries, but the diffusion rate still being slow within a country. And I think this is, so ultimately, a very important point that I wanted to stress in this context, it's the distributional impact that matters. And that's what the history tells us of the Industrial Revolution. It's not the quantity of jobs that have been the major impact. It's been how the distribution has been affected in terms of skills. And you touched on this routine cognitive, etc. But I think a more nuanced look at the skills distribution is critical to understand who's missing out. And this has been most looked at in recent times in the American context. David Autor and others looking at the missing middle. Other work has been done in Asia, etc., on this, and I was wondering if you have any insights on that. But then also, what about within sectors and enterprises? And this is something that was discussing the Indian government when I was still in India, is that there are frontier firms who are adopting technology very quickly. They're at the production frontier, global production frontier. But the vast majority of SMEs, and you didn't refer to anything about SMEs, but the vast majority of enterprises are SMEs who are have a very far distance from that productivity, the global production frontier. So, I think a very important message in that context is then how do we actually work with governments, social partners, and others to promote the right type of technology adoption? So looking at, taking it from another perspective in terms of what drives technology adoption, how can we get the right type of technology adoption which will improve distributional outcomes? It's something that, maybe just if you have any points on that, thanks.
Uma, and then.
Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. I have two minor questions and one which is a big question. I enjoyed reading the chapter. I haven't read the whole report. And what struck me in the chapter was you have a very interesting box on ICTs and female labor force participation. And I think you go on into that particular box saying how ICTs and IT has actually created a number of jobs for women. So my curiosity is much more, what kind of jobs has it created, and why are these jobs not good for men? And it's basically getting into the larger content of work. The second question is you presented about this task relocation, and what I found it very interesting from your chart is that the task relocation in India is pretty low compared to China and Bangladesh. Now both China and Bangladesh actually present a completely different picture. China has both high-end and low-end, and you have Bangladesh with quite a bit of low labor-intensive workers. So, what's happening within these countries, and why is task relocation comparatively low in India, where you have actually an equal distribution across different skills of workers? The other point I wanted to raise is about the graph that you showed on routine versus non-routine with the robotics. What is very interesting is that if you look at the automobile sector in India, especially, over the last 10 years, or even about 15 years ago, when you had a complete shift towards the Taylorist production process, you had robotics coming in a big way, and you had CAD/CAM coming in a big way. Now, what happened was it surely declined the routine tasks within the large companies and the medium-skilled companies, but what it created was a lot of these routine tasks were moved into the informal enterprises. So my question to you is, to what extent a lot of this analysis actually takes into consideration employment that is being generated in the informal sector, or a push of employment from the organized sector to what we call it as the unorganized sector? And my large question to you is, I was very thrilled to see this question that you put up saying what government should do to harness technology for inclusive growth. And when I looked at what you tried presenting was much more with regard to lifelong learning and the usual social protection issues. So the question is, Asia, it's not new for Asia to get into this question. I think Asia has had this whole economic growth miracle that we have talked about. And the question is, why haven't tax policies not changed? And why hasn't social protection been provided to the workers? Why haven't minimum wages gone up? You have a number of countries in East Asia, even today, at really low levels of skills. So the question is, how do you actually move forward? I think this is, for me, the most fascinating question within your presentation, but I do find that I'm not very convinced with the arguments you've put forward. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Andrea Gama from the research department. Thank you for the presentation. It was very insightful, and I like your optimism. I have a couple of small questions regarding things that I think might kind of put a downward pressure on their optimism. The first one has to do with a very dumb question, so I'm kind of toning down the conversation. So what is a robot? Because the way you presented, you're saying, you see, like we have all these sectors with a lot of employment, and there's no robots here, so it's kind of fine. But if you go to McDonald's and you get to these machines where you can put your order and send it directly to the kitchen to get your burger, is that really a robot? As my understanding is, this is just an interface with a computer connected to it. And if we take it one step forward to things like artificial intelligence, we're talking about merely a computer and maybe a server if it's a very kind of heavy thing, but this I don't think qualifies industrial robots, and they still present very big threats in terms of automation and kind of job destruction. And then the second thing was in terms of your argument that you see technology is kind of moving the job pattern toward higher skilled jobs in this region. I wonder how much of this moving away from low skilled jobs to higher medium skilled jobs has to do to a natural development on these countries that leads to workers to move away from agriculture, that it's kind of independent from technology to a vast degree. So maybe this is not necessarily kind of technology related. But my biggest question is it's more a reflection on our work as researchers. We have a lot of opinions when it comes to technology, when it comes to automation and artificial intelligence, what this might mean to what we mean as a job, the value of work to people. On this, we have a lot of opinions and we can talk forever. But then when it comes to actually try to do some quantifying exercises to figure out what might happen, we seem to stop at the Osborne and Frey kind of methodology, right? We have these estimations on how many jobs might be automated, but then we stop there. And we can say how many of these tasks are routine, non-routine, and so on. But we as researchers should be able to push this research a bit further and say, if this then happens in the future and we have this amount of jobs, these different scenarios of job destruction in particular sectors, what happens? And my experience working in Southeast Asia is that when you try to bring this forward, people start being very kind of aggressive about the methodology. They say, no, that if you use this methodology, it's not going to be good because A, B, and C, and this other is also not good because D and F. So on the project I'm working, we have some employment projections for Vietnam at the sectoral level. And what we did was use a report from the ILO that focusing on automation on ASEAN and focus on the 5 biggest ASEAN labor markets. So it's Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And what they find is that about 55% of all employment on these 5 countries is at high risk of automation in the future. So what we do is that we look at the sectors with higher risk, and we impose a negative shock to these sectors to understand what's the feedback to the other sectors. Because it's not only that these jobs are going to disappear, but they can have positive or negative effects on other sectors. And even though that on the model, and this is a simplified model, I'm not kind of saying that this is the optimal methodology, but I'm saying that we do have methods where we can study these subjects further. And what we find is that even when we impose an increase in investment on education and training by the government, and even though we impose higher productivity on these sectors, because we assume robots are going to be more productive, we still find that in the 5 and 10 year kind of period that we're looking at until 2025, we still expect unemployment to decrease. And so my question is, why are we not doing more of this sort of research to try to understand what might happen? Because we seem to have a good grasp of what jobs are more easier to substitute than others, but then we need to understand how this is going to impact our labor markets and the economy as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for this very, very good question. So let me start from the last point. I think you asked what is robot. Of course, we can have, as you said, how to look at the robot. Anything can be considered robot or not. I mean, but what we have used is what the robot the trade statistics. So we use that definition, and then we use the robots, the number statistics. The use of robots. Basically, they provided data on robot sales. So of course, they have different countries. We have focused on the developing Asia, and so the units of robots. So they have to stand differently. They are different. We just use of that definition. So we try not to discuss or identify or argue what is a robot. We just use standard definition. The point is that we want to argue, find the adoption of robots by this definition is associated with change in employment and with the non-routine, routine. So that, and then we did some empirical studies. Then last question is about your question about moving towards lower to medium and to higher, maybe the agriculture. So we do look at different sectors, agriculture sector, manufacturing sector, and the service sector. So we have different results. And I think last question I asked about why not look at actual jobs or tasks, risk of automation. Basically talking about the more micro level studies. So right, so if I understand correctly, our report is more provide a macro picture because we use input-output table and try to decompose the changes over the last 10 years in the employment into different components due to technology, due to rising income. So this study by Frey and Osborne and by OECD data, they use more micro level data survey, and so we have, because in many Asian countries, data is a problem. In the case of, I think OECD also have the data for Indonesia, but we found it very difficult for us to get access to that, and then finally we decided not not to do this because the OECD has a lot of study out there, and we focus more on macro picture. And so I think we try to make some contribution to the discussions rather than, because already the out study, the McKinsey study, and as I mentioned, World Bank study in terms of probabilities of job being displaced. So we not try to re-estimate what was the proportion of the job at risk. So we provide, the more kind of a macro picture. So I don't know whether I answer your question. I don't know the name, but yeah. Okay, job relocation, India and China. I think China actually, during that period of time, we're looking at relocation, job increased. India is, because China is very much involved in global value chain, so, we're talking about the relocation, right? Malaysia actually, we found jobs declined. Relocation, basically, jobs are leaving Malaysia. We have a data show. But on the other hand, Vietnam, I remember correctly, is increasing. So this, the overall, during this period of time, relocation actually is not that significant. Total amount, we're talking about 2 million jobs a year. So, but of course, this is not guaranteed in the future. The reshoring we discussed, right, is a threat. But overall, because since this is now only 10 total for developing Asia as a whole, only 10% jobs are dependent on foreign demand. So we believe that certainly there are risks, especially like a country like Vietnam, for instance, the 20% depend on falling demand. Maybe China is 20%, 24%. But the situation of Vietnam and maybe China very much different because maybe China is already very much high on the value chain. So, but Vietnam, mostly labor intensive, could be a challenge. But that means, of course, slightly there is reshoring, but we need to go government action, the training, move up the value chain, that kind of policy actions. So then that I think the SME, I don't know whether I have a what drives the technology adoption? I think the early question. But of course, technology adoption, in the private sector, and then investment in, so basically provide, the government has to provide the environment so that the private sector can invest. Then government perhaps should also provide incentives for, technology innovation and adoption, some kind of industrial policy. Actually, we, personally, I feel that because of the technology advances and innovation, often market will not work perfectly. You need a kind of government support, to address market failures. And so many Asian countries, of course, 5-year plan, 5-year planning is very important. I think it's a pretty very important role. The vision of leadership, political, leadership is important. So, of course, the government is basically to provide environment, and then fair competition is important. So, these are the things I think. But of course, if you look at the experience in Asia, some countries have done very well, especially in earlier we have a newly industrialized economy, Singapore, Korea, and then early part of Japan, and maybe China. Now China is catching up. So many other countries, Malaysia is also doing quite well. Vietnam actually is very much, where government tried to scale up their, moving up the value chain.
I think if you'll indulge me, I think we can take maybe another round of quick questions, but I would like to first ask my question, which I tabled. I enjoyed the report immensely. I think you picked up on several factors that were interesting and things that we are doing in the ILO or looking forward to do. But I did find, coming out of Asia, one thing a little concerning. I know that you talk about creating 11 million jobs annually, but my concern is, what about the quality of those jobs? And if you look at the joint ILO-ADB report for the ASEAN integration, we saw there that 1 in 4 jobs would be among the ranks of the vulnerably employed. And given the fact that you see within Asia and the Pacific, vulnerable rates hovering, staying constant around 48%. And in South Asia alone, we see rates of 72%. I think it would be useful with this report, maybe the next time around, to take a look about the quality of jobs. Because again, I think this issue that you've already highlighted on, the routine task, the routine jobs in nature, et cetera, could be replaced. But we agree that at a sectoral level, where most of those are concentrated, probably not yet. But what will be the impact? You've identified that partially within the, like I said, the joint ASEAN report we looked at. So that's a question I'd like to know more of. What will be the quality as we move forward? The second, I was very pleased to see your work on the occupational employment, breaking those down. It's something we've been looking at and discussing as well. But you hit on one side is when you talk about cognitive jobs, not maybe being impacted as much, but we've seen in some industrialized economies, some cognitive jobs you would think along the lines like lawyers and accountants have already started seeing a decline because some of their tasks have become, quote, routine and easily automated. So again, I think the issue, the manual jobs, very true that these are very easily done, but I think there's tasks within the cognitive jobs that are equally easy to automate and be replaced. And I think if you talk about moving up the skills, I think we need to understand that some of these will be replaced as well, and their occupations will be impacted. I enjoyed very much your reference to the ATM tellers, which we know freed up a lot of workers to go into other types of sales within the financial, insurance, and real estate sectors. But again, they're all being impacted. So I guess those are my 2 quick observations. I took liberties as the moderator. I apologize to the audience, but I think we can take maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Yes.
Raymond Sanne from the Center for Socioeconomic Development here in Geneva and Basel University. I thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I took note that you also added at the end emphasis on reconsidering tax systems, the social assistance programs that you suggested. That I just took note of that, and I think I'd like to read up the final report to get more understanding to what extent it's similar to what we already have in Europe, like in Denmark or in Scandinavia, or maybe there are new ideas that you have in the report. My questions are very succinctly, quickly. The first one, in the SDGs, as you know, there's a statement that the LDCs are supposed to have a doubling of their share of world trade by 2020. In Asia, you have several LDCs. Does the bank have any suggestion as to how to accomplish this task, which, after all, the so-called international community committed itself to making this possible? About the non-routine cognitive category, I'm very intrigued by that, and I'd like to know more about it, because when it comes to the education, and you mentioned some of the countries are really investing heavily in education, non-cognitive jobs are not learning by, the traditional type of learning, memorizing, and Asia is excellent according to the PISA studies, but I would imagine non-routine cognitive jobs are not yet part of the curricula in most of the countries' educational. So what is it that you would suggest if you were to advise some of the Asian countries how to remodel their educational system so they could anticipate maybe the need for more non-routine cognitive jobs? And the last one is the question about the lady here has already in a way alluded to it. I'm interested to know more about your views regarding the informal sector. Because if we think about there is an impact due to technology, and you have already countries with a very high level of informality, what's happening to these people? Are they going to be left for good? Hence, then we would have to need some form of social assistance program. Or is there anything about your minimum wage that you alluded to and I noticed you didn't mention the word living wage, but minimum wage. Is there something about basic income? What is the ADB's view about the left behind, who probably will still be left behind despite all the technology advancement? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Most of my questions have been already posed, so I have just one question now. I participated in the World Summit of the Information Society, which took place recently here in Geneva. And there was a panel on artificial intelligence. And the debate went into the direction saying, if developing countries are not fighting for developing their capabilities and their capacities to adopt artificial intelligence, take advantage of big data, there will be a new digital divide and a widening digital divide. And the idea was basically that will be the downside of the new technology. So what I want to say is you're rightly, to some extent, optimistic when you talk about new technologies and job creation in manufacturing and the service sector. But when you think about this artificial intelligence and the emerging digital divide, which seems to be a real threat, then my question is, what would your response to that?
Okay. Now, on the last question on digital divide, obviously this is the issue, and so I don't have a clear answer, but certainly when we're saying that developing countries should invest more on ICT infrastructure, for instance, improve education, improve ICT literacy. These are some of the issues we discussed. But at the end of the day, how we will play out. So what we in the report basically highlight a number of policy options. But certainly, I agree with you. This is the issue and implications for income distribution, and some country may lag behind, that kind of issue. So, but what do we in the part we say that, so certainly in the case of issue, the access to internet, the proportion of population have access to internet is still very low. So ICT infrastructure, as far as ADB is concerned, we think it should be a priority, together with other type of infrastructure and education. So, and then international cooperation is important at the different levels. Regional cooperation, for instance, in ASEAN, for instance, the ASEAN Economic Community, they have different blueprints, they have different levels, skill development, skill mobility. These are among the, and then the ICT infrastructure development is. So the countries that are working together, in the regional cooperation. So I don't know whether this answer your question. Then this gentleman, the question of ADB's view on SDG, doubling trade of LDCs. We do have, I think that from ADB's perspective, we support our member countries mainly through infrastructure development. We are development bank infrastructure, so infrastructure, better infrastructure lead to more trade and higher economic growth, we believe, and then reduce poverty. So I think that this is our most important way, but also we have a trade finance program. We have a program to provide financing for trade. We call it, trade finance program. So basically, these are more direct interventions to increase trade. And then we, of course, support the regional cooperation in trade. For instance, we support the free trade agreement, the regional free trade agreement. A number of initiatives. We support regional cooperation in Greater Mekong Sub-Regional Program. We have Central Asia Economic Cooperation Program, and South Asia SASEC as well. So that is what we can do, what we are doing, right? But our main, the instrument is still infrastructure development. Then a question on the tax. I think this is the policy we talked about. We believe that for many Asian countries, the mileage to increase tax revenue as a percent of GDP, and then to make income tax more progressive. So that is. Then I don't know whether so your question about
We can answer mine later.
Yeah. Anyway, quality job, informality, informal sector, somebody. So I think the largest informal sector is agriculture still, right, in Asia. Still, I think more than 40% of jobs is still in the agriculture sector. I think the most effective way is to move the agriculture labor to modern manufacturing and the service sector. This is most important. By promote urbanization, and so that then they will get into the formal sector. So in that sense, Asia is doing okay. Of course, more can be done, but of course, the country differences. Certainly, in the case of China, for instance, doing quite well. Informal sector relatively small, and because of large amount of surplus labor moved from agriculture, they are informal at the beginning. Now in the modern manufacturing service sector. So many other countries, India, I recognize certainly the informal sector is still high, but to some extent related to the regular labor market regulation, for instance. But the government is trying to address that to to facilitate basically to create incentives so that informal workers can move to the formal sector. So I would say the quality, because I know in the past we have done that, for instance, work on working standards, decent jobs, that kind of issues. You are very much inside, But from ADB's perspective, because I think you are in a better position to look at this kind of issue. We actually mostly more broad issues, like for instance, transfer of labor from agriculture to manufacturing and to services. This is in the sense because agriculture is basically informal. So that is from our perspective, because we are. There's a competitive advantage in the sense that we can make a great contribution to all that in terms of discussions as well. But we have a study in the past, in a few years ago. I think Duncan was also involved in, Duncan left, on decent, the job, the decent works in Asia. Yeah. Okay. I don't know that.
All right, well, first of all, let me thank again Dr. Zhang for joining us. Dr. Mello, thank you for joining us. And also
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to put you on the spot on that one, but here, you might find it.
Thanks, well, I think we're going to have lunch.